The phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. I almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant spam, or worse, a robocall about a car warranty I didn't own. But something made me pick it up. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe some part of me had been waiting 5 years for this exact moment without even knowing it. Hello. Silence first. Then breathing. Then my mother's voice, cracked and small in a way I hadn't heard since I was a little girl. "It's your sister," she said. "She needs you." I sat down on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall for a long moment. 5 years of silence, and this was how it broke. Not an apology. Not an "I miss you." Just an emergency wrapped in a plea, delivered like I owed her one. I'll get to what happened next. But first, you need to understand how we got here, because none of this makes sense unless you know what it was like growing up as the daughter nobody chose. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I had an older sister, 3 years ahead of me, and from the moment I can remember anything, I remember being second. Not second in age. Second in everything else. She got the piano lessons. I got told we couldn't afford 2 sets of lessons, so I should just watch and learn from her. She got new clothes for school pictures. I wore her hand-me-downs, even the ones with the stains that never quite came out. When she got a B on a test, my parents framed it like a small miracle, a testament to her effort. When I got an A, it was expected, "Of course you did, you're the smart one, that's just how you are." Somehow being naturally good at something made my effort invisible. Somehow her mediocrity was celebrated like a personality trait worth cheering for. I used to think I was imagining it. Kids do that, they gaslight themselves before anyone else gets the chance to. I told myself all siblings feel this way sometimes. I told myself I was being dramatic, ungrateful, difficult. Those were words my mother used a lot when I brought things up. Difficult. Sensitive. Why do you always have to make things about you? But here's the thing about patterns, they don't lie, even when everyone around you insists they don't exist. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped bringing things up entirely. I learned to keep score silently. The birthday parties that got bigger for her, smaller for me. The report cards that got framed for her and mentioned once for me. The way my father's face would light up when she walked into a room, and how his eyes would just pass over me, like I was furniture that had always been there and didn't need acknowledging. I want to be fair here, my sister wasn't cruel to me when we were young. Not really. She was just careless in the way people are when they've never had to fight for anything. She took the space she was given because nobody ever told her not to. And somewhere along the way, that carelessness curdled into something else. Entitlement. The quiet, bone-deep belief that things were simply supposed to go her way, and that when they didn't, someone else had done something wrong. That belief would end up costing both of us more than either of us understood at the time. By 15, I'd built a wall. Not a dramatic one, I didn't slam doors or scream. I just stopped expecting anything. I got a part-time job at 16, not because we needed the money, but because I wanted something that was mine. Something no one could compare, frame, or hand down to me with someone else's fingerprints already on it. I started saving. I didn't know yet what I was saving for. I just knew, somewhere deep down, that I was going to need it. I had no idea how right I was. Because the breaking point was coming. And when it hit, it wouldn't just change my relationship with my sister, it would change the entire trajectory of my life, in ways that, 5 years later, standing with that phone against my ear, I was only just beginning to understand. The breaking point didn't happen the way I always imagined it would. I used to picture it as something explosive, a screaming match, a slammed door, someone saying the one unforgivable thing that couldn't be taken back. That's how it plays out in movies. That's how it plays out in your head when you're 17 and quietly rehearsing the moment you finally stand up for yourself. Real life is rarely that generous. Real life just wears you down until one ordinary Tuesday becomes the day everything ends. I was 17, about to turn 18 in a few months. My sister was 20, still living at home, still coasting the way she always had. She'd started college 2 years earlier and dropped out after a single semester. No explanation, no consequences, just a quiet return to her old room like nothing had happened. My parents never brought it up again. When I asked once why nobody seemed concerned, my mother told me it wasn't my business to worry about. That same year, I'd been saving for something that actually was my business, a small scholarship program that covered tuition at a state school 2 hours away, plus a modest stipend for housing. I'd applied in secret, terrified of jinxing it, terrified of what my family would say if I got their hopes up and then failed. I didn't fail. I got in. Full ride, plus enough to cover a shared apartment near campus. I remember running downstairs to tell my parents, the acceptance letter still shaking in my hand. I thought foolishly, hopefully, that this might be the moment. The moment they finally looked at me the way they looked at her. Proud. Amazed. Like I'd done something worth noticing. Instead, my mother read the letter, folded it back along its creases, and said, "That's wonderful, honey. But we were actually going to ask you for a favor." The favor was money. My savings, specifically the money I'd been setting aside since I was 16, working weekends at a grocery store while my sister slept until noon. My parents needed it, they said, to cover a debt my sister had quietly racked up. Credit cards. A car loan she'd stopped paying. Money that had, in one way or another, always eventually become someone else's problem to solve. "She's your sister," my father said. Like that settled it. Like blood was a debt I owed simply for existing alongside her. Family helps family. I asked what would happen to my scholarship housing deposit, my moving plans, the apartment I'd already put a hold on. My mother's answer was the sentence that finally, quietly, broke something in me for good. "You're smart. You'll figure something out. You always do. You always do." Like my resourcefulness wasn't a strength they should be proud of, it was a resource to be spent on everyone but me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not then. I went upstairs, sat on my bed, and looked around my room at 17 years of a life that had never once been fully mine. And I made a decision that felt less like rebellion and more like simple arithmetic. If I stayed, I would spend my whole life being the emergency fund for people who never once considered being mine. I turned 18 3 months later. The morning after my birthday, before anyone else was awake, I packed one bag. Not because I owned so little, though I did, but because I only wanted to take what was actually mine. Clothes I'd bought with my own money. A photo of my grandmother, the one person in that house who'd ever made me feel like I mattered. My acceptance letter, smoothed flat and tucked safely inside a folder. I left a note on the kitchen table. Not angry, not dramatic. Just 4 words. I found something else. I didn't know it yet, standing on that porch with the morning air still cool against my face, but that single bag held everything I'd need to build a life my family never thought I was capable of building. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that walking away that morning wouldn't just save me. It would end up being the only reason anyone had left to call, 5 years later, when everything for my sister finally came apart. The first 6 months on my own were the hardest of my life, and I say that having lived through everything that came before them. I moved into the shared apartment near campus with 2 roommates I'd found through a school housing board, strangers who became, in a strange way, the first people who ever knew me without a comparison sitting in the room beside me. Nobody in that apartment had ever met my sister. Nobody looked at me and thought, the other one. I was just me. It should have felt like relief. Mostly, it felt like grief. Because here's something nobody tells you about walking away from a family that hurt you. You don't stop loving them just because you leave. You just learn to carry that love somewhere it can't reach you anymore. I worked 2 jobs that first year on top of a full course load, mornings at a campus cafe, weekend shifts at a retail store that never quite scheduled me for enough hours to feel secure, but always scheduled me for enough to feel exhausted. My scholarship covered tuition and a stipend, but stipends don't cover everything, and I refused, on principle, to call home and ask. Not once. Not when my car broke down that winter, and I took the bus for 2 months to save for repairs. Not when I got sick with the flu so bad I missed a week of work and had to explain to my manager, through a fog of fever, why I needed the shift covered. Not when my roommate's family sent her a care package before finals, and I watched her open it at the kitchen table, feeling something twist in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. I know now that feeling had a name. It was mourning. I was mourning a family I still technically had, but had lost anyway. My mother texted me twice that first year. Both times were requests, thinly disguised as check-ins. The first asked if I could help out with a bill she didn't specify. The second asked if I'd heard from my sister, as if I'd become some kind of family intelligence network the moment I left, expected to keep tabs on a life I'd specifically removed myself from. I didn't respond to either. It wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. I'd learned that every door I left cracked open eventually got walked through by someone asking for something. So I built walls that were, this time, made of distance instead of silence. And in that distance, something unexpected started happening. I started to grow. By my second year, I'd found my footing. I switched majors into something I actually loved instead of something I thought might finally impress people who weren't paying attention anyway. I started tutoring on the side, which paid better than retail, and let me use the mind everyone in my family had always treated as a given rather than a gift. I made friends who called just to talk, not because they needed something. I dated a little, badly at first, then better, learning slowly what it felt like to be chosen without conditions attached. By the third year, I had savings again, real savings, not emergency fund for someone else's savings. I moved into a studio apartment by myself for the first time, and I remember standing in the empty space before I'd bought a single piece of furniture, just feeling the quiet. Nobody was going to walk in and tell me my presence in that room was a burden. Nobody was going to compare the way I filled it to someone who filled it better. I graduated on a Saturday in May. I sat in the crowd of families cheering for their kids, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely at peace with an empty seat where my parents should have been. I hadn't invited them. It wasn't spite. It was clarity. Some doors, once you close them gently enough, don't need to be reopened for anyone else's comfort. By year 5, I had a career I was proud of, an apartment that felt like mine in every sense of the word, and a life built entirely from decisions nobody else had made for me. I want to be honest with you, I didn't spend those 5 years thinking about my sister every day. I didn't sit around waiting for a phone call, plotting some imagined reunion. I'd made peace, or something close enough to it, with the idea that this might just be how my story went. Family in name only. Distance as its own kind of resolution. But rumors have a way of finding you anyway, even across silence. And in that 5th year, small pieces of information started drifting back to me through a cousin's social media post, through a mutual friend from high school, through the particular kind of small-town gossip that travels faster than any phone call ever could. Something was happening back home. Something involving my sister. And whatever it was bad enough that people who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly seemed very interested in knowing whether I'd heard. I hadn't. Not yet. But I would. And when that phone finally rang at 6:47 in the morning, 5 years of careful distance was about to collide, all at once, with a truth that would change everything I thought I understood about who my family really was. I didn't go back right away. After that phone call, my mother's cracked voice, the 4 words that undid 5 years of careful peace, "She needs you," I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. I let the silence in my apartment settle around me the way it always did, and I asked myself the only question that actually mattered. Did I owe them anything at all? I want to be clear about something. This wasn't a story about revenge. Not for me, not really. I hadn't spent 5 years building a life just so I could someday slam a door in someone's face and feel powerful about it. I'd built a life because I needed one. Whatever happened next, I decided, needed to come from curiosity and closure, not spite. So 2 days later, I drove back to the town I hadn't set foot in since I was 18 years old. My mother met me at the door of the house I grew up in, and she looked older than 5 years should have made her. Her hands shook slightly when she hugged me, and for a moment, just a moment, the little girl in me who used to crave that exact kind of embrace felt something crack open in her chest. "She's upstairs," my mother said. She hasn't left her room in weeks. I climbed the stairs slowly, past photos on the wall that I noticed, for the first time with real clarity, had always featured my sister in the center and me at the edges, half cropped out of frames like an afterthought. It didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It just felt like evidence. Confirmation of something I'd known my whole life, but had never seen laid out quite so plainly. I knocked on my sister's door. No answer. I opened it anyway. The room was a mess, not the chaotic mess of grief, but the specific, particular mess of someone who'd been avoiding reality for a long time. Unopened mail piled on the desk. Clothes with tags still attached, spilling out of shopping bags from stores I recognized as expensive. A laptop open to a spreadsheet with numbers in red. My sister looked up at me from the bed, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something in her face I never expected to see directed at me, relief. "You came," she said. I sat down on the edge of a chair, not the bed, keeping distance that felt necessary even now. "Mom said you needed me. What's going on?" What came out over the next hour wasn't the crisis I'd braced myself for. There was no illness. No accident. No danger in the way my mother's tearful phone call had implied. What had actually happened was slower, and in its own way, far more revealing. My sister had spent the 5 years since I left doing exactly what she'd always done, coasting on the assumption that things would work out because they always had. She'd gone through 3 jobs, each one ending not because she was fired outright, but because she quietly stopped showing up when things got difficult. She'd run up debt again, bigger this time, co-signed loans and credit lines that my parents had quietly backed because, as always, family helps family. Except this time, the debt had grown too large for quiet fixes. Collectors were calling. A car had been repossessed. My parents, having drained most of their own savings, bailing her out over the years, the same savings that had once been earmarked, unofficially, as help for whichever child needed it, had nothing left to give. And so, in the absence of a solution, they'd done what they'd always done when things got hard. They'd looked for someone else to fix it. They'd looked for me. Not because they'd missed me. Not because 5 years of silence had taught them anything about what they'd lost. But because I was, once again, the resourceful one. The one who always figured something out. The emergency fund with a heartbeat, expected to show up and solve a problem I hadn't created and had specifically built a life far away from. My sister looked at me, waiting, genuinely, earnestly waiting for me to say I'd help. To offer money, or a plan, or some version of the rescue she'd been handed her entire life without ever once having to ask twice. And that's when I felt it building in my chest. Not rage. Not sadness. Something closer to disbelief so total it came out, against every instinct I had, as laughter. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I wasn't laughing at my sister's pain. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to make this into something uglier than it was. I was laughing because, for the first time in my entire life, I finally understood the joke that had been playing out around me since I was a little girl, and I was the only one in the room who could see the punchline. Here's what I mean. My whole childhood, I'd watched my parents pour everything, attention, money, forgiveness, second and third and 10th chances, into my sister, while quietly asking me to need less, want less, expect less. I'd internalized a belief, without ever consciously choosing it, that being the difficult one, the sensitive one, the one who wanted things and asked questions, was some kind of character flaw. Meanwhile, my sister's carelessness, her comfort in taking without giving anything back, had been treated for 25 years like a personality trait too delicate to correct. Sitting in that room, watching her wait for me to once again be the fix, I finally saw it clearly. My parents hadn't just favored her. They'd built her. Piece by piece, choice by choice, they had constructed a person who had never once been taught how to catch herself, because someone had always been there to catch her first. And in trying to protect her from every hard consequence life ever offered her, they'd created the exact crisis sitting in front of me now. A 25-year-old woman, drowning in debt she didn't understand, in a room she hadn't left in weeks, genuinely believing, because it had always been true before, that someone else would swoop in and make it disappear. Except this time, the someone they were counting on had spent 5 years learning exactly how to say no. I can't fix this, I told her, and I meant it 2 ways at once. I couldn't fix the debt, I didn't have that kind of money, and even if I had, I wouldn't have handed it over. But I also couldn't fix 25 years of a lesson she'd never been allowed to learn. That wasn't mine to fix. It never had been. My mother, standing in the doorway by then, started to cry again, the same tears from the phone call, except now I could hear them for what they actually were, not grief for my sister's situation, but panic at the idea that the emergency fund had finally closed its account. "You have to help her," my mother said. "She's your sister." And there it was again. The same sentence from 5 years ago, word for word, like time had simply folded in on itself. Family helps family. Except this time, standing in that room, I felt something different than I had at 17. Not obligation. Not guilt. Just clarity, sharp and almost funny in how obvious it suddenly was. "I know she's my sister," I said. "That's exactly why I'm not going to do what you did to her. I'm not going to rescue her from this. Because if I do, she'll never have to learn what I had to learn at 18, that nobody's coming, and you figure it out anyway, and it's the best thing that ever happens to you." I left that house an hour later. I hugged my mother goodbye, out of habit more than warmth. I didn't hug my sister. I told her, honestly, that I hoped she found her own version of the bag I'd packed at 18, the one that taught me more about who I was than anything anyone had ever handed me. Driving home, somewhere around the second hour, the laughter finally came back, quieter this time, less like disbelief and more like release. Because I understood, finally and completely, that the very thing that was supposed to have destroyed me, being the one nobody chose, the one who had to build everything alone, had actually been the only real gift either of my parents ever gave me, even if they never meant to give it. My sister got the golden childhood. But I got something she never had the chance to build, the knowledge that I could survive without anyone's help at all. 5 years after I left with one bag, my family finally needed the daughter they'd spent 18 years teaching to need nothing from them. And that, more than anything else, is why I couldn't stop laughing.